Hello, everybody. This is Aran. I'm an educator of philosophy based in Austin, Texas. Today, I'm going to have a very good conversation, hopefully, with my brilliant friend, Trent. Hello, Trent.
Hi, everybody. This is Chen, your old friend, also based in Austin, Texas. I'm a historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. Great honor to be here with you all.
So, before getting started and talking about the main topic of this episode, just a kind of a reminder for those of you, especially that this is the first episode that you're hearing from us. We're the first Zucha, and our project is basically, in some ways, in response to the deficiencies of academic conversations in our times. We try to kind of pursue a transdisciplinary dialogue, and we really do not in our conversations. We kind of cover concepts that are not just situated within a specific historical tradition or a philosophical system. What we try to kind of deal with concepts that have some sort of a transdisciplinary import, not just academically, but also intellectually and emotionally for us as citizens of the world. Um, and in doing so, we also kind of move around fields, move around traditions, and we try to kind of overcome the pedantic nature of academic research that really just throws you into one corner and just that kind of cages you in. We try to kind of explore expansiveness in these dialogues, and that's why you see like we cover. If you look at our channel, you see that we have talked about very specific, like historically significant texts in philosophy. We've talked about Hegel, but like when then we have talked about evolutionary biology. So it's going to be that's why you see that these kind of movements. Every dialogue takes us to somewhere else, and that's the spirit of the first Zucha. What we have been focusing on for the past few episodes is the concept of human nature. And we arrived at the concept of human nature as something central to us due to the flaws we saw in different philosophical systems, more specifically in our inquiry over Hegel, in their lack of critical consideration of the meaning of the concept of human nature and simple assumption of human nature to be so and so. Now, that definitely is not limited to this or that philosopher. It's not even about domain of philosophy, right? When you like open an economics textbook, you see that the whole inquiry starts with an assumption about what human nature is. So for us, it became very important to kind of embark on an inquiry that centers itself on that concept, and necessarily because human nature, the concept of nature, is significant to many disciplines and many people, and many different contradictory areas and schools have talked about it. By nature, we're going to kind of like go to spaces that definitely are not just classical philosophy. They're not necessarily historical inquiries. And at this part of our conversations, we are very much interested in how evolutionary biology has impacted the concept of human nature. And if you look at our past episodes, we have talked about a number of approaches to the concept of human nature that are influenced by evolutionary biology. And what is interesting is that even though they're all kind of influenced by evolutionary biology, they are going very different ways. And some issues in those conversations became very important for us. And one of the main issues was the relationship about this kind of biological element and the cultural element, and the concept of biological and concept of cultural, the categories as how they kind of pertain to one another, how they're connected, how they're disconnected, which one is about nature, which one is not about nature, and um, we kind of started to see like different kind of possibilities in connecting nature as biology with culture. But we realized that there is a position there that is very important and in some ways very controversial in its understanding of the concept of culture. And we were like, why not? Why not get there? And that concept or that approach that uh, ultimately becomes an approach towards the concept of human nature is evolutionary psychology. And in the next couple of episodes, evolutionary psychology is going to be our focus. Now, if you haven't watched those videos, that's absolutely fine. We invite you to watch them. You can watch this as an inquiry on evolutionary psychology and the text that we're going to tell you about in a second. So you don't need to watch those videos. I just wanted to give you this kind of a context of why we're talking about this and letting you know that this is part of a broader conversation and could take us places, unexpected places. Great. Anything to add there?
Yes, I think I would just want to second some points you mentioned in the very helpful introduction, and perhaps to paraphrase it for those who are not familiar with our whole intellectual enterprise. The first thing the word you used, I think, is very fitting. It's the word using a transdisciplinary approach. In a sense, it's very much like this channel. We have a lot of different clusters of episodes, each like situated in a specific field, asking a specific question. Those could be understood or communicated on its own right. It's like how normal science or disciplinary research is conducted in our time. You don't necessarily need to know, say, cultural history to make sense of Hegelian philosophy, vice versa. However, we discern certain shared concern of the unity of knowledge, integration of different approaches in virtually every discipline we look at. And that's why we're motivated to think to reflect and identify certain helpful vocabulary as well as questions that could help us to connect these shared concerns across disciplines. And I hope, dear listeners, that you will find this certain recurrent themes like the relationship between culture and nature, as you mentioned, universal individual, as well as the nature. Integration of knowledge, playing of references connected all our episodes. So if you have not listened to our previous episodes, totally fine. It doesn't hinder your understanding of this one, but I personally encourage you to explore and try to identify the connections for yourself. Yes.
Yes. Beautiful. Now, the evolutionary psychology is like a developing field, and it's of course it's been very actually present in not only the academic circles but also more like popular science and like figures that are associated with it. Even like Peter, like Steven Pinker, like people like that are part of the evolutionary psychology, and they are part of like for the lack of a better term, like the public intellectual kind of a space that we are living in. But one of the foundational texts in evolutionary psychology was actually an edited volume that was written in the 90s. And the book is called The Adapted Mind, Evolutionary Psychology and the Generation of Culture. But we can also think about evolutionary psychology and the question of human nature. Right? And in this edited volume, we have chapters that are more concerned about the theoretical aspect of evolutionary psychology in the sense of justifying evolutionary psychology, not just as a legitimate field, but also as a legitimate field to talk about human nature against certain other kind of approaches that exist, right? So the book it starts with that and ends with that in some ways, and in the middle there are specific case studies of why like evolutionary psychology actually explains human nature, right? Our focus here in this book is going to be mainly on the opening article the psychological foundation of culture, that is written by the editors of this book, the husband and wife, John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, that they are also like the pioneers of the field of evolutionary psychology. Again, although this book was written in the 90s, the foundational aspects of like the theoretical enterprise called evolutionary psychology, a research program called evolutionary psychology, it still functions within the same kind of a paradigm, right? So the foundations that Tooby and Cosmides provide are still in use and informing the field of evolutionary psychology. They are still active. Last time I checked, at University of Santa Barbara Center for Evolutionary Psychology, and they have collected in this book many case studies that are cover like fields of study of as wide as like gossip and to just mate selection and landscape choice. Like it's just a very wide range of studies, and they're not, to be frank, from the same quality. And we're going to touch upon some of those articles as we move on. But the main focus is on the psychological foundation of culture. I think that's when the main argument is embarked. The less is the application of the argument in different fields. What is evolutionary psychology, and what it does is one of the main points of the article, Psychological Foundation of Culture. Basically, we want to situate evolutionary psychology and see where it stands in relation to other forms of knowledge, and also how it pertains to the concept of human nature. There are four initial features that are very much clear in this article that are they're going to inform our conversation about and take the text a little later on. One of the very interesting things is that how human nature is actually already accepted as a scientifically sound concept, and that the authors of the article are not really casting doubt that human nature may not be a very, reliable concept at all. They actually think human nature is something that it exists. It's as simple as that. So if you guys are familiar with the work of like David Hall and John Dupré, there is a radical skepticism of the concept of human nature, and David Hall and John Dupré are not going the same direction in their criticism. But basically, the idea is that once we take evolutionary biology seriously, there is no concept of nature, human nature or crocodile nature. It doesn't work that way. And the very basic idea there, but we don't need to get into it, is that genetic mutation is about variation, and there is nothing about the last variation that works as a norm of saying like whether the next mutation belongs or doesn't belong, right? Those kind of categorizations of the boundaries between where mutations are varied enough to just have their like be a new branch or tree of life are just taxonomic concerns and might have some pragmatic functions, but they really don't give us any sort of a nature, quote unquote, for any species, right? That's not how life unfolds in nature. Life unfolds as one thing, one continuous element, and the rest of the categorizations of it are up to us. they don't even show like the evolutionary psychologists um, any sort of mild skepticism because we have figures like Grant Ramsey, a contemporary philosopher of biology, and Ramsey just like, yeah, like nature. If you're thinking about nature as some sort of essence, sure, there is no human nature. But if we kind of get a snapshot of humanity at any point, we can talk about like, here are the characteristics that describe what humanity is about. And maybe some of those characteristics are more durable and like transmittable to the next generations. But yeah, there is change, so we cannot think about nature, but we can think about some sort of a stability in like this kind of the clusters of traits that exist within our species. Not even that. Like the way that like the article starts about human nature is that of course human nature exists, and of course human nature is something that we can scientifically account for. And this is not just about like an axiom that they accept, I don't think, is that because they think um, evolutionary biology inherently relates to creation of certain psychological mechanisms, then they have no choice other than accepting that human nature exists. But let me don't go ahead of myself. Pause for a second and see what Trent has in mind, and then we'll talk about what they mean by the point about psychological mechanisms.
Yeah. So thanks a lot for relating that with what we discussed so far, like philosophy of biology. I think the contrast is really meaningful. First, I think their horizons are very different. For instance, the three figures that you mentioned that are on the slides, the David Hall, John Duplay, and the Graham Ramsey, they consider themselves theories of species evolution, and from that, like a grander natural history point of view to explain the position of man, well, in the archaic vocabulary, in nature. Therefore, human nature must not be taken for granted. But for evolutionary psychologists, the human mind is their subject of study, which is the totality of their world. So it's not controversial within that field to take it as self-evident that we have the shared subject of study, and this shared possibility of zooming into the same phenomenon itself is predicated on a at least functionally essentializable category, namely mind or human nature. So I think that's the key difference here. And I think we need to step back a little bit on why evolution psychology is very important in our long-term discussion, because I think it's trying to do multiple things. First is providing a big history account of how do we get where we are now. So that's really important. They're not trying to assume a say divine position to see the world from the beginning to the end when there's no human and there will be completely different form of human communication or existence. They're taking a very specific historical standpoint in my eyes and explain how do we human beings now have a global community, how is it the case that we can learn each other's languages, how we can communicate with each other, we can adopt each other's kids and raise them in a completely different cultural environment, yet still made those adopted kids like very much natural citizens of the new environment, distant from their like natal places. So those are the questions I think interesting to them. So they're looking for certain robust theory to account for such pan-human propensity of exchange and like building community stuff like that. So that's really important way to bridge, I think, in the long run, the natural sciences and social science or humanities, because such a position is often assumed in humanistic studies. Like a lot of religions, they have the idea like human beings are all connected, the same. A lot of cultural traditions are founded on such an assumption, and then certain cultures disagree with it. I think this position matters not just within its own field, but also as a how to say intellectual position, meaningfully contrastable with other disciplines or cultural traditions. So I think with that said, we can better understand, or at least sympathize with it to a certain extent, why their starting point is so radically different from philosophers of biology, that the very existence of human nature is not discussed, but rather assumed at the very beginning. And also why their position is questionable in our eyes if we step outside that specific field and try to really pursue the line they're pursuing, that they're advocating, namely an integration of different fields to answer the same question. Because we will see in the future that, especially in their criticism of what they believe a dichotomized model in prevalent in natural as well as social sciences really hinders collaboration across fields to describe and scientifically study what unites us as human beings. So with that said, we should
Yeah,
with the
yeah,
remaining
that's
part.
excellent. Yeah, that's excellent. And I think it's like if you go to an evolutionary psychologist and say that, hey, like, but you were just kind of like, you know, it might be the feature of your field to you that you just start with like, studying of the mind and like you have to assume like there is like, human beings are separate from other species and then you kind of casually use the human nature, but that might not be correct. You might say that, hey, like maybe we start there as a matter of this is disciplinary habit, but we're going to show we have something to show for it, right? That we have something to show that actually there is such a thing, right? And the way they want to do that is to identify human nature um, through talking about some basic psychological developmental mechanisms of framing and filtering the world. And those words matter, and it matters in terms of like how they relate with other thinkers uh, influenced by evolutionary biology as well. So the idea is that first of all, okay, human nature exists. Here's why it exists. Here's how it exists. Um, Human nature exists through some pan-human psychological mechanisms. Okay, and these pan-human psychological mechanisms are not just given in the form of a trait, which is going to be important, but it's not like a trait that you're born with and it's on your face, or like from the very beginning. It's about like kind of a program that unfolds, right? And that program that unfolds uh, is not at birth, right? Like menopause is definitely is not necessarily like a psychological program. It's more a physiological program, but it's a good example for it. Menopause happens much later in life in a subcategory of human beings, right? But you know, whenever a woman is born, the clock is ticking for menopause program to start, right? Uh, in a more psychological sense, we can think about this as, being a rebellious teenager, right? When you're like 2, that program hasn't started yet, right? But it will get started when you're like 10, when you're 12, like based on whatever, like there's a range, right? The teenage rebellion doesn't start when you're 5, and it doesn't continue when you're 32, right? So it has a specific period, just like, different kind of physiological developments are. I'm mentioning this point to emphasize on the point that these are psychological mechanisms that are not happening concurrently. It's not like that they all start happening as we are born. Some of them are, some of them like will appear later on, but they are all in one way or another um, concerned framing and filtering the world, right? Which is a broad way of like understanding it, but I think it could be helpful actually, because one of the things that we are going to talk in more details is that, or one of the points of concern that makes evolutionary psychologists posit these psychological mechanisms is that the world is infinitely complex. And if you don't approach it with a strategy of filtering things, then you can never have anything out of it, right? If you are like indifferent to whatever stimuli is in front of you perceptually, then you perception becomes impossible because unless you filter, disregard, suppress, categorize, you cannot really see anything. Right? Now, we're going to talk about that, but I think that there's an interesting element there. When we speak of development, right? When we speak of development, something curious happens because development is not just like, well, in one ways, you can think about every trait that every human being has as something that is developed, you know, in the embryo, right? It's just like nose is developed, right? But there are some traits that when we are born are just traits as like things that are there, you know. Um, but development, um, it seems inescapable to introduce the concept of environment when we use the term development, because when something gets developed, it's very hard to imagine that we can think about development without considering that, hey, this develops in this temperature. This develops in this kind of a context. This develops when, you are socialized, right? Like there is some activators of the developmental programs. There are some activities that might hinder the developmental programs, right? So one of the themes that are going to be present in this book is that like it's not about like gene determinism in the sense of like you just have a trait. It's about the development of certain characteristics, and that requires an understanding of how environment influences our developmental programs, and that itself is its own very interesting dimension that we have talked about developmental approaches to the concept of human nature by Stutz and Griffiths and Dupré as well. Uh, their concept of environment, I think, is going to be very different because I think one of the main things for evolutionary psychologists is that this environment, whatever the environment is, it doesn't change the developmental program. It just kind of like shapes how it's unfolded. Or the environment is not determining human nature. It's just like letting it kind of reveal itself, right? Human nature is there. Environment is a space that kind of reveals human nature, which would be very different from someone saying that the environment changes the developmental programs, introduces new developmental programs, and introduces cultural developmental programs that are just not given, and that very much determines human nature. That's not what evolutionary psychology is saying. Environment has a very specific, just kind of a context for pre-programmed, mechanisms for them, and that's going to be important in our conversation. Sure. Do you have anything about that?
Yeah. When I was reading this very long introduction chapter, just to give listeners a scale what we're talking about, this article is twice as long as the Grimm's Ramsay's booklet on human nature. So we're talking about 150 pages, like ground laying conceptual thinking. And I was particularly struck by how fluent the two writers were on cultural anthropology. And this specific line itself is a great example of that. Because if you substitute psychological developmental mechanisms with culture, this can be written by a cultural anthropologist. That's how they conceptualize human individuals learn to navigate this extreme, as you said, extremely complex world. You need certain cultural systems, symbolic systems, education program to help individuals to identify meaningful, like points of contact, exchange, and the appropriate way to approach those sites of meaning or power. And so framing and filtering. Anthropology would say culture is doing that, and they are proposing the exact opposite. No, no, no. It's actually nature that is doing that, and that's really important because I think you did a great job emphasizing that for them, the environment, the role of environment is a secondary to the unfolding of, say, human nature or human development. Yet, for other people, um, the relationship between development and environment will be very different. So I think it is not wrong to say that for them, human mind perhaps is both the beginning and the end of human evolution. That the mechanism of the direction of evolution is kind of, I won't say decided, but guided in what is inside the human, and the human beings therefore use that psychological mechanism to filter the outer world, to extract resources, so to speak, to let that to develop and unfold. So it is the beginning and the end. The environment plays, strictly speaking, a secondary role there. And that's why we'll see when they were criticizing cultural anthropology, or when cultural anthropology, imagine, criticize back, the fight is going to be, where do you locate the agency? For them, it's clearly inside a human mind, but for cultural anthropology, no, 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 no. To have a frame, to filter information, you need stuff outside individual human mind. In like social relationship or symbolic system to do that. Environment is way more important than you think. So I think you did a good job identifying their position. I just want to highlight that their position is very different from cultural anthropology, yet at a certain level, there are similarities between the two in terms of that clash of like where to find agency or driving force of history, so to speak, to account for the historical process of acquisition of such developmental process or mechanisms. Yes.
Yes, and I think that's very relevant to the point that we're going to get there in a moment. But I think the comparison that you were making is kind of a structural similarity between these two very different um, approaches to human nature, is that both of them are foundationalists, right? They just locate the foundation in different places, and that's going to be itself something that is very interesting to us. But before talking about that, just I wanted to add like one more thing about this kind of like subordination of culture to psychological mechanisms. That's just basically what you said in terms of like locating mind as this kind of locus of human nature, and then culture happens, uh, you know, as an expression of that, right? But not as like anything that could challenge that psychological mechanism. And I think it's interesting to see that for the evolutionary psychologists, there is this kind of a one-way road, right? That you've got like the baby is born, the baby has these programs, and the programs are ready to go, right? And that what determines what that baby is, which is a human being, and that human being has these mechanisms. That's it. Even people who are rather inflexible about the relevance of culture, like Ramsey. If you remember that Grant Ramsey, or if you don't know, this point might be relevant. But Grant Ramsey thinks that whatever myths and stories that different cultures come up with as what human nature is, that is irrelevant. We got to go back and see what actually is like cultural self-interpretation doesn't have any room in determining what human nature is. But even Ramsey accepts and talk about this and emphasizes actually this kind of a for the lack of a better term, like biological reductionism, that if a culture puts a religious taboo around consuming certain food, right, that will have very clear consequences on variety of issues, right? We can think about biodiversity of gut bacteria based on the nutrition regimes of different cultures. We can think about like lactose intolerance in certain cultures versus the others based on this kind of a cultural limitations. So for someone like Grant Ramsey, definitely something that is starts in culture can have an end in nature, right? But I think for evolutionary psychologists, nothing will touch that kind of the ground psychological mechanisms, right? And as we are going to talk about this, for those of you who are like approaching this from more like a philosophical lingering, there's a very Kantian structure of thinking, right? Because there are this kind of a priori categories that everything they are kind of grounding experience itself. So no experience can change them. Experience is dependent on them. They're so basic that even something that is challenging other experiences is still using the same structure, right? I think that's the idea here, that there is this kind of untouchable element. Now, this is the last point here that gets us to that point about foundationalism, and then I will pause and see what Trent's thoughts are. And the idea is that there is something about like the evolutionary psychology that makes them less of a Kantian enterprise than Kant himself. Because for Kant, not knowing anything about, like not situating humanity in evolution, Kant would think that this is kind of like a design. We are that kind of an entity that has these categories, and that's the end of the story. But of course, evolutionary psychologists, we hope, are aware that evolution is something that is like ongoing, and it's not like it is just like we have. There was a time we didn't have eyes. There was a time we didn't have, the psychological mechanism to assume the continuity of an object. Right? All of these are emergent properties within the evolutionary ground. Right? So if that's the case, one might ask why we need to think about these psychological mechanisms in this kind of a very foundationalist view. And the answer that evolutionary psychologists give is that number one, these psychological mechanisms are adaptations, meaning that they're not just like random things that emerge. They emerge because they serve a very important role, and that role goes back to a very basic level of survival, successful survival, and like which includes like taking care of offspring, so on and so forth, right? So basically, because these are adaptations, they are very strongly present. And these adaptations, these psychological mechanisms as adaptations, were kind of like attached to our species when we're hunter-gatherers, right? And basically, that basic structure of them hasn't changed. We're not in caves, we're in cities. We're not hunting rams. We are sharing posts on social media, but like our psychological mechanisms are the ones that like hunter-gatherers have that, right? So I just want to point at an assumption there and then leave it to Trent to just kind of make it clear that this kind of reinforces that idea that cultural change does not change the basic psychological mechanism, right? So the fact that we're using phones doesn't change our basic psychological mechanisms that were developed as adaptations during the hunter-gatherer era of humanity. And one might wonder why. Why is that? Why the new adaptations do not emerge, or why adaptations are just kind of fixed and rigid? And I think the evolutionary psychologists would say that, again, going back to that kind of a Kantian thing, in like Kantianism informed by evolutionary biology, those things are so basic that it's just like very hard to change them, and it's not maybe beneficial to change them from the standpoint of evolution, or it hasn't been. So in one way, like the evolutionary psychologists, I think, have no choice other than accepting that some of these psychological mechanisms can possibly change, but their change is just like takes a million years. Like it's not gonna be like, you don't give milk to a child and observe Ramadan and have this kind of a physical exercise, and then suddenly you have new adaptations. No. And then those are not adaptations, those are just like maybe like local changes to minimal things. The psychological mechanisms um, remain the same. This foundationalist approach, as Trent was also mentioning, mirrors more than anything else what is going to end up being the enemy of evolutionary psychology more than its cousins, right? So the people that are developing ideas about human nature or refuting human nature based on evolutionary biology, they are in a lot of ways not foundationalists in the same way that evolutionary psychologists are, and that's going to be important in our further conversation about them. Trent?
Yes. I like what you just said. Like the analysis of the term fundamentalist position is really important, and I think that's what makes um, evolutionary psychology particularly attractive to certain Kulturwissenschaft, the interpreters of culture, so to speak, be it through the historical discipline or through anthropological discipline. And my response to what you said is to emphasize a parallel trend or a line of argument implicit here. It's the relationship between universal and the individual or cultural diversity. That's something really plagues cultural anthropologists to a large extent. It's how to make sense of human diversity in terms of cultural expression. And first, you can take a foundationalist point of view. We have something outside the realm of culture that it dictates or makes the culture possible. That's exactly the evolutionary psychologist's position on this. But most anthropologists are not taking that position. But then they have the conundrum of explaining how is it that they, from a radically different culture, can meaningfully say anything about another culture in which they're not born in. Do we have some pan-human mechanism that allow us to make such like a quantum leap across cultures so that we can go to Southeast Asia, that's the example of Clifford Geertz, and observe certain local, really particular local activities like cockfights, and use that to help us to think about how like hierarchy or meaning was created in our society, like in the sense of industrialized North American and Anglophone society. So evolutionary psychology provide highlights that we have certain universal set of a priori mechanisms, as you said, in the content language. And that's very appealing. And it's in fact used secretly in cultural anthropology. Like so long as you interpret, you are assuming that we have the ability to interpret something we are not born into. And so that's really congruent with like between the two camps or enemies. They share something really fundamental. And the second thing is their emphasis on the hunter-gatherer group, which I think makes the whole evolutionary psychology thing really appealing to materialistic or Marxist historiography, because they say, well, before we look at a superstructure or culture, we look at how did people persist, how did they like materially reproduce themselves, and in that sense, they are emphasizing, well, we are not that different from our ancestors, hunter-gatherers, because we know based on their name, hunter-gatherers, the whole life existed to find food and feed themselves. So we must not forget that when doing cultural interpretation, despite all the expressed cultural differences, all human beings are shared by their absolute need of finding sufficient food to procreate and to continue the evolutionary process. So again, underneath the cultural diversity, there are some universal human concerns. And using such a thing, we can interpret different social structures across time, and from like, I don't know, feudalism to industrial society. I think so. So again, they're probably not a big fan of Marxist historiography in the classical sense. So no, the class struggle is to like misidentify stuff like that. But yet again, they and their enemies share something, I think, fundamental. And that's what I think evolutionary psychology is interesting, not just for philosophers, but also for any Kulturwissenschaftlers. Yes.
Yeah, and I think there is just one quick thing, and then we can just move on. Is that I think their point, as you mentioned, their emphasis on kind of finding this kind of foundation, pan-human foundation, is very understandable. Like it's just like their emphasis is not to just kind of their attempt is not to just be reductive. Their attempt is to make sense of communication. And when we see kind of their criticism of the dominant social sciences models of human behavior, we're going to kind of see this better. Like what kind of problems plagues the anthropologists of our time and in the past, and also other cultural analysis. So now that we know this kind of like picture of like human nature, kind of like the skeleton of it, we know that we're ready to kind of see what exactly evolutionary psychologists try to find and what they think they are finding when they find that, right? So definitely they're interested in finding pan-human, extremely stable, content-specific psychological mechanisms that emerge as adaptations in our evolutionary history, right? Content-specific is important, right? These psychological mechanisms, first of all, are universal, extremely stable, and they are not just containers for, they are not general capacities, right? And that's going to be one of the main kind of like points of tension. They're not just like capacity for culture, because any like relativist cultural anthropologist also could say that, yeah, they're pan-human conditions in terms of like, physiology of the brain that serves as the possibility for culture, but anything is specific that someone does is about culture, right? No. Evolutionary psychologists once say that when it comes to like very specific things, mate selection, information transmission, behavioral tendencies in different ages, it is this pan-human, extremely stable mechanism that is talking. It's not just random culture stuff, right? And by finding these types of specific pan-human, stable mechanisms, psychological mechanisms, evolutionary psychologists try to like achieve something that they call conceptual integration. That there is a mutual consistency between various disciplines, behavioral and social sciences on one hand, and natural sciences, right? In the sense that, like, what evolutionary psychology wants to say is that it's not that there is like something like evolutionary biology, and then that's over there, and we don't need to worry about that because it's just about capacity in general. Then there is culture over here, and like culture, like people can talk about culture, right? For evolution psychologists, it matters that whatever is uttered as like explanation of a cultural behavior must be consistent with what we know about evolutionary psychology. Just like any kind of like engineering project must be consistent with the discovery of physics. Like if you have a plan for building something that is not consistent with the laws of physics, that doesn't make any sense, right? If you have an apparatus to make sense of cultural tendencies based on whatever, like a Freudian school of thought, without really kind of connecting what that school of thought has to do with evolutionary psychology or evolutionary biology in that sense, and worse, if that kind of enterprise is in direct contradiction with the findings of the natural sciences, then we have a problem. Right? that's an important problem. Now, in that sense, despite the reluctance of accepting the term, we can think about evolutionary psychologists as some form of a variant of explanatory reductionists, in the sense that for them, the cultural phenomena is not sui generis. It doesn't kind of like create a field of its own. Like the cultural phenomena that exist within societies must be consistent with the evolutionary psychology, because evolutionary psychology has its roots in evolutionary biology, and evolutionary biology kind of encompasses the basic features of what we are, right? It's these things are not like forming like independent disciplines that have nothing to do with one another, right? But because, as we mentioned, evolution psychologists are very reluctant or very much against thinking that culture can really touch these basic psychological mechanisms, then there is only one way that the consistency makes sense. And that's to say that the consistency makes sense by saying that the cultural phenomena is explainable through evolutionary psychology, right? Now, maybe on surface level, the mating strategies of you know, a tribe in Malaysia that is isolated from the rest of the world might be very different, might look very different from like how people use dating apps in Michigan. But there is something basic about both of those activities that explains their behavior. Of course, there are different environments. That's not refutable, but the core of the cultural phenomena is the same, right? So psychological evolution psychology can explain like what we are doing in the cultural setting. Okay? Now we're gonna have some important issues with this, but here I just wanted to kind of present it as what I think is logically inferable from that enterprise. Right?
Yes, I think you did a great job there. The what I want to highlight, the only point I want to highlight here is their integration, conceptual integration, kind of has an implicit hierarchy of approaches or disciplines. The most we can perhaps think of it vertically. The upper you go, the more manifested or intuitive the differences of phenomena are. For instance, how did people actually say date and seek mates? But the lower you go, the more foundational, more universal, more stable the mechanisms are. For instance, we're thinking about, according to evolutionary psychologists, the resources can be provided in such a potential spouse, stuff like that, which dictated both how Michigan people used the dating apps and assimilation, like tribe leaders selected mates, for instance. And upper division disciplines that would have root in the lower one. So it's not perfectly symmetric in that sense that the claims made in evolution psychology could seem superficially incompatible with cultural phenomena because we can explain away that differences through contingent factors in environment. And we have already emphasized that for them, environment is a secondary compared to the kind of inborn mechanisms of which enabled individuals to filter information and navigate the complex environment. But it was not the other way. You cannot use a theory to explain culture, but that the fundamental assumption of the theory is utterly incompatible with the mandate of, say, the law of evolution of biology or even physics. So the vertical or conceptual integration envisioned by such thinkers in this discipline have in my eyes, a clear hierarchy of different bodies of knowledge and how they interact to each other is not perfectly symmetric. There's certain kind of a chain of command, so to speak, there, and we could adjudicate issues in different disciplines by appealing to perhaps that's an implication. They didn't spell it out explicitly. Stuff in the lower level. And the most important thing for them is the disputes that in the uppermost level, say among cultural anthropologists and socioscientists, like what's the relation between culture and society, stuff like that. If you want to answer this question, you can never find an answer in sociology or cultural anthropology, but you might be able to find an answer if you go deeper, namely evolutionary psychology. So that's why they feel that evolutionary psychology is in a position to provide a unifying framework to kind of reconcile what in their eye unjustifiably compartmentalized interpretive disciplines of human interaction and behaviors. And we will go into that in more details when in their criticism of the existing models provided in anthropology and sociology. Yes.
Yes, and with that, I think we will benefit to just touch upon this point and talk about it in the next episode because I think this episode is getting a little bit long. So I think I would just kind of like put this out there as like a sketch, and then we're going to return to this in the next episode. As Carl Schmitt famously said, to define a boundary, in his case, in terms of like his political unit, you need an enemy-friend distinction. And evolutionary psychologists aren't exempt from that. So a lot of energy has been spent in the psychological foundations of culture in adapted mind to describe the enemy, debunk the enemy, and create the alternative in contrast with the enemy, right? And that enemy is like some sort of a dominant social science model that the evolutionary psychologists identify, and there are figures that they directly talk about, like Clifford Geertz that we're going to talk about, and Emil Durkheim. There are figures that they don't talk about directly because I don't know if she was even around as an intellectual or like academic back then, but like Judith Butler and like gender studies and like fields of that kind, right? That may not have been as like dominant in the 90s that they are now or in the past decade. But all of these are going to have the same problem, right? And to understand why evolutionary psychology works, we got to start with this kind of describing these enemies. As we're going to tell you at the beginning of the next session, there are some photos that are not here, and it's important that they're not here, right? You don't see Marx here as one of the most influential social scientists of like starting 19th century to our time, or Max Weber, right? And there is no mention of those. In fact, there is a mention of like Marxist anthropologists as allies without mentioning Marx's name. And we think that's something important. But Trent, if you don't mind, let's just finish this episode, and then at the beginning of the next episode, we're just going to delve into this kind of animosity.